Good morning, all, and welcome to Critical Faculty. Is science under attack again? This is not going to be the first time and probably not the last. I've got with me Dr. Lawrence Krauss and his recent book, The War on Science. Good morning to you, Dr. Krauss. Here it is.
Good morning. Nice to be with you again.
Thank you so much. I mean, we're going to get into it because you've got a hell of a schedule ahead, the promotion of your book and so many broadcasts are sort of ahead. What's the vibe like?
Well, there's a lot of interest. I'm pleased to see the interest. Of course, I wish I didn't have to talk about this subject. The What I would like more is actually more publications in the center or left to feature it. In Canada, I've gotten some, but in the States, it tends to be, unfortunately, at this point, more places from the right that are promoting it. So we'll work on that because I don't want to preach to the converted. And this is unfortunately an issue where the right is sort of one of the rare cases where, in my opinion, where the right is on the right side. In any case, there are two. Let me just point out there are two attacks going on in science, at least in the West and at least in the United States. One is a real external attack coming from the current administration that's cutting science budgets, attacking universities, trying to keep out foreign students, it's done in response to what has been going on for the last decade, this culture war that's happening within universities, and that's what I want to talk about. I don't want to defend what's being done by the current administration. I've written about the fact that I think it's hurting science and may hurt it in the long run even more than the internal attack. But the external attack one needs to deal with at the ballot box or other ways. But what this book is about, and by the way, most of all of the 39 essays in it were finished before President Trump was elected. We've done a little addendum, and they're about the longer term war on science that's going inside, the attack on free speech and open inquiry, and even sound science that's happening, a kind of postmodernist attack. And people are being afraid to speak out because they're often losing their positions if they ask questions. And there's sort of these bureaucracies called DEI bureaucracies that are enforcing discrimination essentially and restricting appointments so that merit isn't important, and merit should be the key thing. The bottom line is, when it comes to universities, nothing should be sacred. Everything should be open to question. That's the one place where absolutely everything should be open to question. There should be free and open debate, and that's essential for science. Science is a dialectic. It requires debate. When you put out a scientific paper, you expect it to be analyzed and often critiqued by your colleagues, and that's the way good ideas survive and go to the fore. Without that kind of debate, science can't progress. And unfortunately, too many areas that kind of debate is ending. So that's a quick sort of brief summary of. And let me just say, I created this book and I compiled this list of 39 people who I got to do this. Just very distinguished academics from around the world. And the key point is here, they're from many different disciplines, not just one, not just even the hard sciences, and also many different political persuasions. Because I don't want this book to be viewed as a right-wing external attack on universities or anything like that. These are people within universities from many different political persuasions and, as I say, disciplines who are speaking out because they're concerned, and hopefully we'll be able to convince our colleagues who are often either afraid of the consequences of speaking out, or who simply want to keep their heads down and avoid the whole issue, that they need to speak out to take back universities for the faculty and for research and open inquiry.
One of the things that I'm really worried about is you obviously you're approaching this from a neutral point of view, from the science point of view, which is what is going to benefit free inquiry. However, the tug war that gets involved every time something is raised between the right and left,
Yeah.
how this is going to distort the actual image of what you're trying to achieve, because they are trying to make a political sort of statement and get on the right side of you or the right side of history. How is that going to affect the narrative?
Well, that's the problem. Politics should not be part of the narrative, and everyone's using their own politics. You can't. One of the problems of the current response of the current administration is you can't fight intolerance with further intolerance. And you may not like what's being done in the university, but you can't demand that certain ideas not be discussed. Also, while many universities are guilty of a lot, Harvard has rampant anti-Semitism and discrimination against, say, Asian males, and for in acceptance rates and all the rest. Those are the things you should attack, but you shouldn't take the whole thing. You shouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater. It's not as if all scientists are woke and all of science is not good. There's incredibly important science being done at Harvard, and it's tragic for me to see my colleagues there, many of whom are incredibly good scientists, losing their government grants. So the right has made this a political issue because they're attacking, rightly, a number of the problems that are going on, but they're doing it with a broad brush instead of a scalpel. The left, of course, is making this political in other ways. They're making the claims that science, in some cases, is white supremacist or racist or sexist without any evidence, and often distorting the science for political goals. I mean, you can't even talk about, in many cases, you can't even talk about sex and gender for fear of being canceled from universities. One of the colleagues who wrote here, Carol Hooven, was essentially had to leave Harvard for saying on a TV program that sex was binary. Um, Talking about crazy things like decolonizing mathematics, somehow making it all seem as if it's Western supremacy. Mathematics, pi is pi. Uh, the circumference of a circle is the circumference of a circle. And in fact, a lot of the early part of mathematics was done in say, the Arab world. Zero algebra comes from algebir, and but independent of who does it, that's what's important. One often doesn't ever learn the history of mathematics when one is doing mathematics because the people aren't important. It's the ideas. If there's one area of human intellectual inquiry that should be divorced from politics and social, the vicissitudes of society, it should be mathematics. And then even in science, people are making these ridiculous claims that used to be just in the province of the humanities, where postmodernism was rampant, and the idea that there was no such thing as external knowledge, and that all knowledge has to be understood in terms of power and oppression. That used to be the narrative, and we used to laugh at it in the sciences. But one seeing it, incursions of that into the sciences, when there are physics papers, as I discussed in the book, published in journals, one of them saying, whiteness in physics, talking about the use of whiteboards uh, as somehow an example of white supremacy. This is just nonsense. But it's not just nonsense in an abstract sense that affects certain disciplines. It affects people's lives in a real way. There are a number of doctors here and people talking about medicine where in real ways the quality of care is being affected. The fact that you can't talk about, say, certain diseases and race as if it's racist is hurting treatment for things like sickle cell anemia, which predominantly affects the black population, or right now in Canada, as I point out, the CanMeds discussing the new medical education in Canada, but similar things are happening in the United States. They specifically say social justice concerns in education of doctors is more important than medical expertise. Now, I think most people who go to a doctor would rather have a doctor who knew what he was doing than one that was completely sympathetic to all of the social concerns in the world. And this is really going to affect people's lives in a real way, and it's hurting. It's hurting because the notion that, like in Canada, for example, discrimination in academia is legal. You're allowed to discriminate against groups if other groups have been previously discriminated against. The notion that somehow two wrongs make a right.
Make right.
It's,
Jesus
it's
Christ.
ridiculous. And so you see many ads saying no, basically no white males can apply. And I have many colleagues whose students just see there's no hope for them in academia anymore.
For the life of me, I'm trying to understand. I mean, the older war, it's quite justified. You've got a dogma and doctrine, it's a sacred one, and suddenly science have come to expose the whole thing. So I can completely understand the pushback. But we think we've evolved as a species, and now we understand the value of science and how, and it's almost like as if it's either hard science or human empathy, like as if we can't have both of them at
Well,
the same time.
and look, like many things, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. The notion that there are inequities in society and they need to be dealt with is an important thing to recognize. Unfortunately, what that's morphed into is, first of all, a misplaced notion of how to deal with those. The way to deal with societal inequities is not the level of professors, people of doctorates from prestigious universities. If you're worried about inequities in education, go into the inner cities in the United States and try and ensure that there are textbooks in those schools and an environment where students can learn and that sort of thing. But you can't solve the problem at a level of you know endowed professorships. It's just ridiculous. Moreover, it doesn't solve the problem. There's so many examples that quotas just don't work, and moreover, they're not needed. The notion that universities are sexist or racist is false. For 40 years, when I was almost 40 years ago, almost no 30 years ago, when I was chair of a department in a physics department in the United States, when we hired someone for a new faculty position, if it wasn't a woman, we had to write a letter explaining why, because there was great emphasis to try and get more women in science. And we hired the
It's
first two
insane.
women in my department when I was chair. Fine, there was a time when that might have been, and even 30 years ago was probably not necessary, but maybe 60 years ago it was. But this is today. Today, in fact, women dominate over men in academia and across the board, except in a few disciplines. But when it comes to undergraduates, it's about 60%, 40% women to male. Even all the way up to PhD graduates, women dominate. And in many of the sciences, the life sciences, women dominate. The idea that somehow you have to make every discipline reflect the background demographics of society is
It's
ridiculous.
impossible. Yeah.
Because people choose what fields they want to go into. If you take, some of the Nordic countries, which have probably the most equality, if you want to call it, between the sexes, there's larger gaps at certain STEM disciplines for gender gaps than there is in say the United States. People choose what they want to do, and if there is if the population in that field doesn't reflect the background demographics, you can't immediately say it's racism or sexism without any evidence. That's the other thing that's so unfortunate is scientific societies are many of them just jumped on the bandwagon, especially after George Floyd, to argue that racism was systemic without any evidence of that. And for me, one of the examples of how empty that kind of language is, and pejorative in many ways. It actually hurts people, as I'll talk about. Hurts the people that people are trying to help. But when someone I knew well, Francis Collins, who was the head of the National Institutes of Health in the United States, made a statement after George Floyd that biomedical research was systemically racist. Well, if he really believed that, he should resign. He should have resigned because he was leading that organization for a decade. That kind of empty language doesn't help anyone. Moreover, trying to overcome it by quotas just hurts. Not, as I say, not only does it not work, but it hurts the people. When you have jobs in Canada saying open only to people who identify as women, transgender, or two-spirit, um, then when someone gets that job, there's always going to be an asterisk after their name. Were they the best candidate, or were they hired because of their gender, or any some other aspect of their identity? This kind of notion is ridiculous, and the distortion of science, the distortion of the difference between sex and gender, um, as they say, medical issues, genetics, and in certain cases, attacks on really basic science like physics and mathematics is hurting, is just not only distracting from progress, but it's hurting, and it's meaning
Yeah.
that many people are now looking to go outside the West to study. because
Yeah.
because to be politically correct and that kind of policing of language is so has been so extreme. Now it's there's I'm happy to say that that that's being recognized, and there are efforts in certainly the United States to try and change that in certain ways, and the public is beginning to understand it. But the only way to really change it is to get faculty on board and get the public to better understand some of the nonsense that's happening, and that's the why we're speaking out.
When you were talking now, I thought in my mind, this is artificial selection. I mean, in terms of selecting talents. For me, if people are naturally talented, they're tuned to be wonderful at something. You should let that rise regardless of whatever. But now, if we're going to start artificially selecting certain facades that we want to promote in society, while covering up certain maybe shortcomings in a person aptitude or natural talents. How is that going to affect the future going forward?
Well, I mean, it affects the future in many ways. First of all, there's a for a generation, people of talent are turned away. The people who could be making the discoveries of the future are either turned away or turned off from even going into the fields. Okay, and the other thing is it affects not just the quality of research, but the quality of education. If people are coming into academia who are not the best, they're not going to be producing the best students. But moreover, if they're more interested in social justice issues than their field, well, they're going to obviously impact upon the next generation of students who are similarly going to be interested in that. But they're not going to be teaching people how to critically think. You talk about critical faculty. That's the whole point. Critical thinking, being able to ask questions, being able to disagree, is an essential part of progress in academia and in scholarship. And if universities are places where instead there's dogma that's enforced, and certain ideas are not allowed to be discussed, certain things can't be questioned, then you have then education itself goes out the window. Everyone who goes to university should have the experience of confronting ideas that are completely different than anything they believed before. And it's I'm not the first. It goes back hundreds of years to say that free speech is not to protect the speakers, but protect you, the listener, so that you might learn that you're wrong. If you never hear anything that disagrees
Mhm.
with what you think, you'll never learn when you're wrong, and that's a tragedy.
So, I mean, as I said before, it's completely justified in the past. The dogma of religion was trying to protect itself because now we found out the world is not as it seems in the holy text. What is being protected now?
Well, I mean that you hit a key point. What we're seeing is a kind of secular religion, where
Mm.
it's the same kind of thing where heresy is the case. If you speak out, you're excluded. It's very similar. The only difference is, I suppose, that in at least some religions like Christianity, there's the idea of redemption. In the secular religion, there's no such similar idea. And the ideas that are not questionable are often are that there's inherent or systemic sexism or racism if things don't meet the background demographics. That that sex is a construct rather than a biological fact. Those kind of ideas are are being protected in the sense that if you question them, um, then you risk exclusion or worse. Another idea is that somehow indigenous knowledge, which of course, from if you're studying the history of ancient cultures and cultures that go way back, understanding how they understand the world is interesting. But claiming that indigenous knowledge about, say, in astronomy is equivalent to what we're learning from modern telescopes, if you even ask the question, and as one of the people in our book did, whether that indigenous knowledge should be treated on the same level as modern astronomy, she was eventually fired from her position as a tenured faculty member at her university.
You're kidding? You're serious?
No, I'm
Really?
serious. That's the kind of thing that people don't realize is actually happening.
So it's almost it's perceived as an insult for the First Nation people type of thing.
Well, it
It's an
is. It,
insult.
it, it is, and it's also an insult when you argue that somehow, one of the arguments that was made in a grant in Canada to decolonize light, and it was a grant given out by the government. I mean, nonsense, complete nonsense. But one of the arguments is physics is too hard, so we have to make it easier so other people can understand it. Well, in fact,
Oh
that
my God.
that is racist, right? It's arguing that certain groups can't do physics, so we have to get rid of the hard stuff, the equations.
It's called the fallacy of low expectations.
Exactly, exactly, uh, that's extremely problematic at the very least. It's kind of racist, but it demeans the whole field. In New Zealand, they had the government required that indigenous knowledge be taught alongside modern scientific knowledge in classes as if they were equivalent when they're not. I mean, obviously, there's some indigenous knowledge that's scientific, like what herbs might cure diseases. Those are very important, but not the kind of myths about the creation of the world and that sort of thing. And what's kind of interesting? It's another one of our speakers who was also canceled. Or one of our writers who was also canceled pointed out we long ago fought with sort of Christian fundamentalism when it came to intelligent design versus evolution. I was part of that fight. We don't want religious dogma introduced in the science classrooms, but somehow when it's indigenous religious dogma, that's acceptable. And you see museums in the United States putting warning signs above certain exhibits saying these exhibits have strange powers. That don't go near them if you're pregnant, and things like that. That kind of mythology, that kind of ancient religious.
Do you think Dr. Krauss is to do with the guilt? Okay, well, we've invaded you once before, we slaughtered you, so maybe it's time to pay back now.
Well,
Be a bit nice to you.
I understand that, but even that, I find um, that kind of virtue signaling patronizing because in Canada where I live now, it's every event I go to, I have to hear that this land was occupied by some indigenous group since time immemorial, which is not true because even here in Prince Edward Island where I live now, they make the local tribes here, the Mi'kmaq tribes. Even in their history, they actually expelled an earlier group that was here. Okay, but saying it's from time immemorial is false. But worse, we say the unceded land. We're here because we're on their land. And if you really, really meant that, you'd leave. You'd give it back. But it's just
Yeah.
patronizing language that means nothing. And I think it doesn't help anybody. Instead, we should just we should treat everyone with respect and everyone's cultural background with respect. The indigenous background of Canada, of people in Canada, we should treat with respect and interest. But we should also treat that for other immigrants who've come later, their cultural backgrounds. We are a melange of people of many different cultural backgrounds, and it's worth enjoying and respecting and celebrating all those cultural backgrounds, but not arguing, first of all, that one is intrinsically better than another. I mean, that's just replacing the earlier claims, which were true, which were arguing that somehow that when people from Europe came and occupied this country, they somehow argued that their culture was superior. We don't want to now step backwards and say no, their culture is inferior because they occupied. Well, as I say, almost every group, except for the very first people to walk across the Bering Strait and come into North America, largely tended to push out another group that was there. It's a history of humanity, and
Yeah.
and you can't live today the people today are not responsible for the injustices of 100 years ago or 10,000 years ago,
Yeah. Agree.
and arguing somehow that we have to live today as if those injustices are still true demeans everybody.
It reminds me of like if we sort of minimize this whole saga into one person, and that one person has had a horrible past and completely lives in the past all the time, and not trying to overcome the issues of the past so he can actually be a better version of himself. Are we sort of holding humanity back by focusing too much on the past and saying, well, we've got a future now? Because I would argue that even First Nation people were not the first. They probably have taken it from some other
Yeah,
people at some
exactly.
point.
And by the way, what we do is in many areas, if we want to learn who was the first, we're kept out of that. Because when you find an ancient skeleton that's 10,000 years old, that has as much genetic relationship to the people who now occupy the land as to you or me, the rules are that you have to bury that skeleton. You can't study it. So we can't even learn the proper history of which is really learning about ourselves and our origins. It's tragic when people say we'd rather not know than know that our myths are wrong. And that's to some extent what that fight was about intelligent design versus evolution. The idea that you'd rather not have knowledge than the possibility that knowledge will prove you wrong is the whole antithesis of science. In fact, it was the basis of a lot of religion. And
Mm.
it's a shame when it's actually happening within the sciences itself. And we have to, we just have to fight that. We have to fight that, not because not to demean anyone, but just because we have to go where nature takes us. We ask questions and nature gives us the answers, whether we like them or not. And you know what? That's another example that we talk about in the book. It's happening in science journals. The Nature Behavior and the Royal Society of Chemistry editors have both said that they will not accept papers that are correct if they potentially offend some group. I mean, that's if you'd asked any scientist 50 years ago if that was possible, they would say no. The notion that some scientific idea might be inferred by some group as causing offense, and therefore we should not know about it or publish it, is just awful. And in fact, as you may know from the end of my introduction of the book, I talk about the Dutch person uh, uh, who invented the microscope, and I can never pronounce his name, Leeuwenhoek, I think. But anyway, this is now 300 years ago when he when using this microscope, he discovered spermatozoa, human sperm,
Hmm.
and he wrote a paper and sent it to the Royal Society, and he wrote to the president of the Royal Society and said, if this is too offensive, don't publish it. But back then they published it, and are we just taking this giant step backwards 300 years? And it's the kind of thing that scientists need to speak up about. And ultimately, it will hurt our society because it'll hurt our progress. And ultimately, questioning and information is important for a democratic society, for educating people to be skeptical so that they can, be skeptical of what they hear among politicians and look for empirical evidence as the basis of public policy. And politicians one day may never happen, but maybe one day it'll happen where they'll say, you know what, we were wrong.
Yeah. And look, and true transparency now is a key, because you might get the people from the expelled, the religious community, who would have actually argued at some point that the academia is corrupt, and there were anybody who would be going against the science or sound science to their point of view is actually hurting science. So would that give them a bit of now sort of a platform to go, hey, look at, we told you a long time before.
Well, and that's what I'm worried about. That's why I didn't want this to be seen as a right wing attack, because it does give people ammunition, and it causes the kind of uninformed and inappropriate actions that I think are happening now in the United States, where because of the problems we've talked about, the assumption is that all of academia is somehow spoiled, and that's just not the case. There's important work going on. Most of the really good scientists just keep their head down and don't even bother with this stuff. But
Mm.
that's part of the problem. If you remain silent, you're going to suffer. You might suffer in the end. And so to argue that academia itself is sour and we should just get rid of all universities, and I see that in response to some of the articles I write, that's nonsense. We need to ensure that true liberalism and the Enlightenment, which has brought the world so far in the last 400 years, needs to be protected and preserved and enhanced, not removed. And this notion that all academia and all of science is somehow tarnished is really bad, because you have people who then believe that vaccines don't work, and
Mm.
everything becomes political, and your truth is whatever you want, when in fact the whole point of science is truth is not determined by you, it's determined by nature. And if you love an idea and the world, and you do an experiment and discover it's wrong, you got to throw it out like yesterday's newspaper, instead of holding on to it as if it's something central to your being.
The subtext of your book is 39 renowned scientists and scholars speak out about current threats to free speech. I believe you are running sort of a daily or semi-daily broadcast with different. Are the 39 people that you're?
Yes. We're managed to do 20 of them, and it was an exhausting effort. Um, and 20, actually there'll be 21 in the end, I think, because Gadsad did one with me, and we'll probably include that. But it's 20 of the people speaking about their chapters, and every
Right.
day, and we're now on day 16 actually, and and so you can go to the Origins podcast on YouTube and watch those, and everyone has a different point of view to some extent and talking about different issues. There's some overlap, but that's the other thing I did because I believe in academic freedom. I chose people because of the quality of their work and in many ways that trying to get a broad spectrum of scholars. But I never told them what that some people said, what should I write? And I said, you write what you're
Hmm.
passionate about. And so you'll find that there's some people who have different takes on things in here. There's some overlap, people talking about some similar things, and that's fine too. And you'll see that in the podcast as well.
And finally, because I understand your time is a bit tight, that's going to be the final question is, and this might be a valid one. Okay, where it's just like, okay, science is cold. It gives you hard facts. We human need to sort of deal with it in a way that will ensure our survival. So CRISPR, for example, with gene editing, we probably can do way more than with what we can actually do, but due to ethical reasons, maybe repercussions. It's not just being kind-hearted, but being also very pragmatic about if we get involved too much into the natural selection of things, we might actually disturb certain parameters that we're not aware of. So you get the philosophy of science where it says, okay, well, you've got now these facts. What are you going to do with them?
Well, look, but that's the point. In order to have public policy that's good, it has to be informed. And you're absolutely right. Science can be used for good or bad. The science is independent of that, okay? But how we as a society decide to utilize it and exploit it depends upon our being properly informed. And so when it comes to democracy in the public, that's where it's most important that we don't couch the results of science in dogma, or we don't assume certain science is inherently bad. We instead look at it and say, now we can analyze and we can ask, what are the potential repercussions of this? Take CRISPR. As you know, I did a podcast with one of the people a woman who won the Nobel Prize for developing CRISPR, and we talked about the possible implications. But to do that, you have to understand what CRISPR is, what it can do, and what it can't do, and then you have to think carefully in advance about the possible consequences. As a physicist, nuclear energy, nuclear weapons. I spent a lot of my life. I was chairman of the board of sponsors of the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, trying to warn people of the dangers of nuclear war. Just now, 2 days ago, was the 80th anniversary of the first dropping of the atomic bomb in Hiroshima,
Yeah, you're right.
and
Yeah.
and we still have not changed the way we think about nuclear weapons. If anything, people have become more ignorant about them. So we need to educate people about the consequences of physics or biology or any kind of science if we want societies to then have policies that are informed and to protect ourselves in the long run. So, saying that science is intrinsically bad, I mean, the best example I can think of that's shocking perhaps comes from my friend Steven Pinker, who says that's like saying architecture is bad. Because, some architects worked on the concentration camps in Nazi Germany. And therefore, because they produced these awful, disgusting, horrendous places, all of architecture is bad. Well, I think the example, speaks for itself.
It's very obvious.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Now, what would you like to see in 10 years' time? What would you like your message to, how would like you to be received, and what
Well,
kind of reaction should it trigger?
well, I'd like to. I think, as I say, I think there's hope. I think the situation is turning around. If there wasn't any hope, I might not have created this book. But the last part of this book involves not just discussion of the problems, but proposed solutions. And clearly, universities first stating up front that free speech and open inquiry is essential. Secondly, stating that they will not have universities will not take political positions. One of the in the at the epigraph at the beginning of the book, I have three quotes, and they're important. I chose them for a reason, and one of them is from Lawrence Summers, who is the former president of Harvard University, who said universities need to abandon the concept that they have a central role in moral education. Universities are not there to tell people what's right and wrong. They're there to tell people to think and decide for themselves and argue and debate. Another, Heather McDonald says the university has no capacity to eliminate hate, nor should that be its mission. The mission should be to educate and get people to think, and hopefully, if they're enlightened, hate will go away. But it's not to uh, not to say what that certain ideas are bad or certain ideas are good, and so universities need to state up front that they will not take political positions. There's something called
Otherwise, how they going to be different than how they going to be different than churches and synagogues if they are indoctrinating people?
exactly, and there's something called the Chicago Principles, created the University of Chicago. Dorian Abbott, who's here, talks about that. Universities have to adhere to this notion, and the other thing is, finally, university administrators have to finally get some backbone. They have to be willing to stand up instead of being afraid of a mob and willing to throw a faculty member under the bus if somehow they say something politically incorrect. They have to be able to stand up, and that's maybe going to be one of the hardest things to get these people to get the kind of academic. University presidents used to be distinguished academics. Now they're largely salesmen who try to raise money every day and are worried about perceptions. And universities have to go back to the fundamental principles and say we'll stand behind them. So and faculty need to speak up. I think it's certainly possible for that to happen. There are other specifics that are discussed in the end of the book for ways that universities can change the way things are done. We have to get rid of loyalty oaths. We have to get rid of requiring all incoming students or faculty or prospective graduate students to write essays explaining how their work is actively anti-racist, in spite whether they're working on string theory and 11 dimensions. Um, we have to stop requiring people to adhere to political ideology in order to get positions, and I think that's possible.
Uh, just as a question here from one of the viewers, do you think DEI a failure,
I
or
think
can
it's
it be
worse than a
done?
failure. I think it's
Mm.
worse than a failure. It's harmful. Look, the intent, people can say, how can you be against diversity, equity, and inclusion? Well, in fact, but those are just buzzwords. Inclusion is exclusion, keeping certain groups out. Equity involves not equality of opportunity, but equality of outcomes, and that's the problem. Diversity doesn't allow diversity of thought. In fact, diversity is designed to, in fact, again, exclude certain groups, genders, or race. So DEI as an acronym may sound good, but it's wrong, and it's overtaken universities. The growth of administrators at universities has far exceeded the growth of faculty or students. It's a cancer that's largely taking over many universities. And what's worse is it's not the faculty themselves. The people who should govern the university are the faculty, not a set of
One
administrators who don't understand science, don't understand education, but have an axe to grind or an ideology to grind. And too often in universities, those groups have incredible power. They answer to no one, and everyone is afraid of them.
Now, one final quick question before I bid you goodbye. Um, the power of cancellation. People need to earn money. People need to live, and sometimes they have to play the pragmatic game of, okay, well, I'm going to be cancelled, probably going to lose my livelihood here. I might just shut up and just, pretend nothing is happening. How do people stand against that power of cancellation where big committees and big organizations can cancel you and suddenly you're out of work?
Look, I don't want to advocate anyone that they risk their careers. I mean, I understand the fear, especially of junior faculty and other people, of speaking out when they don't have protections, but even senior faculty don't have protections anymore in most universities. I think what you have to do is ultimately what you can do is work quietly, work with your colleagues, find colleagues. And and the point is, if enough people speak out, they're not going to cancel everybody.
Hmm.
I think there's a lot one can do, and the first thing one can do is try not to promote the ideologies that one finds prevalent. Trying to step back and dissociate oneself from that as much as possible. The next thing is to try and encourage and have discussions with one's colleagues, especially sympathetic colleagues, to try and build up some kind of consensus. And then, as the groups build, I think there's incredible power, because you know what? The vast majority of people at universities haven't bought into this. They think the ideas sound good and they don't want to be against diversity, equity, and inclusion, but they don't realize what they really are. But when they learn, they recognize the danger. So I think it's a matter of educating. your colleagues and working behind the scenes. But I don't advocate anyone. I speak out, and the people here speak out, but I don't activate anyone. I don't advocate that anyone risk their job or their livelihood to join this, because I understand, people have families and have to take care of them.
Dr. Krauss, the link to your book, Amazon link, is in the description of the video. Your wonderful podcast is in there as well. Is there any final words you want to say about your book and how people can get it, and be the hard copies? And are they going
Well,
to
the
be?
hard copy you can get electronically. You can get a Kindle version or the hard copy by going to Amazon. Amazon isn't the only place. Barnes and Noble, most of the online sites do it. It would be great if you go into your bookstore, and if they don't carry it, ask them to carry it, because the book is produced by a small. Although it's sold by Simon Schuster, it's produced by a smaller press, and those smaller presses have far fewer salespeople, and bookstores tend to take what the big publishing houses salespeople tell them to take. So I encourage you to go into your bookstores and look for it. And if you like it, write about it and encourage your friends to read it. Because I think the whole point here, my whole point is not to sell books, but is to get people to do something useful.
Well, it's quite legitimate. It's quite ethical to do both at the same time. We all need
I write
put
books
food on the table.
I write books and hope there's something there that'll be of value, and I certainly hope people who do read it find it of value.
Absolutely. So, look, thank you so much. I've known you now for 6 years, and you've always blessed me with your, your chats, and I'm forever grateful. Thank you very much, Dr.
Thank
Krauss.
you. Well, you keep up the good work there too. It's always a pleasure to talk to you. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you, folks. We'll see you in the next couple of days. Thank you.
Bye-bye.